Hey, I'm chatting with Keith Banks, who is a former police officer, COVID operative, current author of at least 2 books that I know of, speaker and advocate. Good morning, Keith. Welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
G'day, Michael. I'm very well, mate. Always enjoy these sort of conversations and meeting interesting people myself.
That's good. Look, thank you for agreeing to join the podcast and for agreeing to have a chat about your undercover experiences firstly, but obviously we'll talk about your time in the police and your books and what you're currently doing now. I guess I want to start with getting an understanding or a brief overview of what you've done in your career to date.
Okay. First 20 years of my working life, I was a Queensland police officer from 1975 to 95. I started as a junior cadet, so I joined the year I turned 17, 2 years in the academy, then sworn member. I resigned in 1995. Not for any other reason than I was just emotionally broken. I had no idea how broken I was until many years later. But I just needed to leave because I loved the job, worked in a variety of areas in the job, and we'll obviously touch on those later. But had I stayed, I don't know what the result would have been. Probably not good. I was very fortunate. I was approached and offered a job in the corporate sector. So I took that up and I worked for Coles Myer, the then largest retailer in the Southern Hemisphere, for 5.5 years. They had a study program, so I did a mature age MBA, which they paid for and put me through and so on. Brilliant program. I then I got a bit restless and moved into the supply chain for security. I managed a Victorian security company. Worked across a couple of areas there. I went back to Borders Books and Music in retail as the Asia Pacific loss and risk manager. Then the Borders business model was folding worldwide because they had a Kodak moment where they didn't actually take notice of emerging technology, sadly. So I then moved into a general management role with a security organisation across Australia and New Zealand. I was made redundant from that role after a couple of years, and that was a bit of a shock. That's what happens in the corporate jungle. Did a little consultancy for a while, and then I ran another startup company for a fixed-term contract of 18 months, which again was still working across Australia and New Zealand. Then I was approached to apply for a role with the Housing Industry Association as the Deputy Director for Victoria. Picked that up. Worked there for 7 years, I think. And then my last corporate role was Chief Operations Officer for the Real Estate Institute of Victoria. That position was made redundant a couple of years ago. This time I was very happy for that to happen because it enabled me to do what I do now. And in the meantime, I'd written 2 books, and you're right, I'm working on a third. But I'd written 2 books that were published by Allen & Unwin, the largest publisher in Australia. So I was pretty flattered about that. That enabled me to move into a network of public speaking and advocacy for mental health and post-traumatic stress disorder recovery. Not that you can ever fully recover from it, but as someone who's suffered with it for 3 decades undiagnosed. My platform now is to use as much opportunity, influence as I can across many networks and drag the conversation about mental health out of the darkness into the light where it belongs.
And it's very true. It's something that I grew up I grew up being told that it's something you don't talk about, and especially in the police. It was always, if the minute you mention something about it, it's like, you need to leave type thing. And I dare say your experiences in COVID, which we'll come to, were probably worse than mine in the sense of support in regards to the organisational support and those sorts of things. So and that wry smile gives it away, definitely.
There was no support, mate. There was absolutely zero.
How did you end up in Victoria? Is it that you're like an AFL team better down there, or? No,
I'm one of those rare males, mate. I don't watch football. I prefer to do stuff. So sorry to all those who do watch football. That's all good. No, mate. I married a Victorian.
Okay.
I've written about how I met my wife in my second book. It's she was a serving Victorian detective when I met her.
Yep.
I was running the wing clipping tactical or strategic intel arm of criminal intelligence working on outlaw motorcycle gangs. So I happened to be in Victoria. So I met her. We had a long-distance relationship. She then later moved to Brisbane. She left the police and moved to Brisbane. After I resigned from the cops, I think I had another 12 months or something. And then I was promoted or offered a promotion to Melbourne. So, she wanted to come back. And I was
seemed like the right thing at the right time.
Yeah, and look, I just needed to break my world. I needed to get away from things that were triggering me and, all of that environment. I saw that as a great opportunity, so I've been here ever since.
Funny, I can relate. I did exactly the same thing, but I came back to Queensland. So you've written 2 books. You're in the middle of writing a third. What was the impetus for writing the first book? How did that come about?
11 years after I resigned, I had a major, probably a breakdown, or very close to it, major anxiety attack, quite crippling. And I started seeing a counsellor. I had no idea about counselling. And it was 2006. So, I went through a stage of seeing counsellors, trying to find the right one, knowing full well that I had issues, not understanding what they were, all of that. So, off and on for the next probably 10 years or so, in and out of counselling offices, no regularity, trying to probably fix myself, I guess, through, exercise and as much research as I could. Not having a great deal of success because I still, drank way too much. I was angry. I was withdrawn. I was all of the classic symptoms of PTSD. I started writing a couple of chapters to give to my daughters because they were then older. They'd grown up with me in that whole world of post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's a disorder for a reason. It's named a disorder for a reason. If it affects your life longer than 4 to 6 weeks, it's a disorder. So I wanted to write something to them when I was getting better. Now, I have to clarify, I was never physically violent. I was never mentally abusive. I was just withdrawn. I was just, had anger about little things that would flash to the surface.
And I think that's the thing with, sorry to interrupt, I think that's the thing with PTSD, that most people will see it as outbursts of anger that become violent, whereas for a vast majority of people that suffer with it, it's small things like snapping at the dog or that sort of thing, which yes, is a violent reaction, but it's seen as, in society, it's probably seen as, okay, well, that's just an everyday reaction, and that's what it's put down to. Things have just gotten too much on that particular day, if that makes sense. And there's no understanding across that a number of these little things add up to maybe something like PTSD.
Yeah, look, and again, book number 2, mate, I've written about how someone told me I might have PTSD and I didn't believe him because I thought that was only for people who'd done really dangerous stuff. And in hindsight, I'd been in gun battles, I'd lost a mate, all of that stuff, which is really dangerous stuff.
Yeah, it does.
So I started writing. I wanted to give the girls something to help them understand why I had been like I had been for so long.
Yep.
Even I didn't write chronologically. I just started writing some things and gave it to one of my daughters to read, and she loved it. Gave it to a couple of friends that I knew that I trusted, and gave it to a guy I trained with in my karate dojo. All of them came back very quickly, and the conversation was, that was excellent. Where's more? We want to read more, about your life. So I just started writing, mate, and the first one I did with a co-author. You can call him a ghostwriter, I guess, but I'll be nice and say a co-author because, he helped me refine my writing style. He wanted to write creative fiction, and we clashed about that because I wanted the book to be raw and authentic.
Yep.
He's a little bit more flowery in his prose than I am, and you'll see the difference between the first and the second book. The second book is pretty raw. Not that it's badly written. I'm told it's actually better than the first, but I didn't have any flowery descriptions of stuff. I talked about life as it was.
Yep.
It was pretty raw.
Yep.
So that's why. So, and what happened after that, Michael, was that they were published. The first one was published by Alan and Unwin, as I said. A lot of media, a lot of great response. And then we had the infamous lockdown in Victoria where our esteemed, and I use the word sarcastically, Premier Andrews decided that we're all going to die, and so he locked us down like, Starlight 17. It was shocking. But during those lockdowns with brief moments of freedom, we were forced to work from home. So I just started writing the second. And just, again, this one was chronological for the most part, but I just started writing it, and I had a letter from the publisher or an email, that came from the publisher who, this grandfather of publishing, as I call him, very, very funny man. He said, "So, Keith, I hope you're enjoying lockdown. What's happening with your second book?" And I'd written about, I think, 3 chapters or 4 chapters at that stage, so I sent them back to him.
Yep.
And literally within 3 or 4 days, he'd send an email back with an advance payment and a contract for the second one. I'm like, wow. So
that's pretty good.
Very happy with it. Yeah, I'm very flattered. Very flattered and very honoured that they picked me up as an author.
Why do you think people like to read, and in my position, listen to, watch, whatever it is, absorb, consume stories about policing or undercover policing?
I think true crime. The true crime genre, whether it be written or audio or visual, scares people a little bit. And because you and I both know there's a whole netherworld out there that the average person never sees.
Yep.
I think it scares them a little bit, and I think they want to maybe know what they're missing, and they're happy that they're missing it. There's also a component of healthy, normal human curiosity about the evil that people can do to each other. A variety of reasons, When I worked in the book industry and Borders, the true crime genre, the largest demographic was women.
I've heard that a number of times. Just on that Borders thing, do you think somewhere along the line that planted the seed of this writing idea?
Look, it may well have. Although, on reflection, my favourite subject when I was at school was English, and I enjoyed writing then. I enjoyed reading great writers.
Yep.
I had a pretty ordinary childhood from a domestic abuse perspective, so my escape from that was the library. I used to go and spend hours in the library just reading as much as I could, because for me, books were an escape and an introduction to other worlds that you would never experience. So when I, always wanted to write something, but like most of us, I had imposter syndrome. I didn't think that my stories were valuable enough or anyone would want to read them. Having said that, mate, perhaps like you, I was great at dinner parties. I always had entertaining stories. People would say, "Tell me another one, tell me another one, tell me another one." And you collect them over a career.
Yeah.
Policing is, I think, probably 95% boring paperwork and 5% sheer terror. And the sheer terror part is what people want to hear about.
Yeah, and you're right. Dinner parties are always the sort of thing, and that the imposter syndrome is quite funny, because this podcast, not so much the interview parts of it, but the other part of it, telling the stories, grew out of a desire to probably write a book. And I wrote the book and went, you know what? That's shit. Maybe I'll turn it. And I went, no one's actually, because it was that period where all the bookstores were closing down. It's like, no one's going to read a book. Maybe I'll turn it into a movie. So I pivoted and put it into a screenplay. Life happened and other things happened, and I went, meh. Then I've come back and I've gone, look, I really want to get this out, and I'll delve into why I want to get this out, because I'll ask you some of these same questions a little later on. But it was like, how are people consuming this sort of information at the moment? And that's how I came up with the podcast. Short, the stories can be short, punchy, get it out there, and people can then listen to it as well. When I started, I thought I'll get 100 listens. If I can get 100 listens over the entire series of the podcast, I think I pitched myself 15 stories. I'll be happy. Job done. We're up around 3,000 now, and I'm just sort of going, oh my God, people actually like this. It's the sort of thing that you sit there and think to yourself, no one's going to want to listen to this, no one's going to know this. But when you do it, as you had with your book, you've written the first one, and then the publishers come back to you and said, what's happening with the second one? it's like, okay, I'm not that imposter that I think I am. People want to listen to this.
And I think also, mate, it shows the human side of policing. You and I both know the emotional impact and toll it takes on human beings. A lot of people's only experience with policing is getting a traffic ticket,
Yep.
Unfortunately. But there's a lot more to being a cop than that. It can take a massive human and emotional toll. On the other side of the coin, it's an occupation where you can genuinely help protect people from predators, bring some justice to society, as cliched as that sounds, and actually get some bloody good outcomes. So I wanted to write about the price you pay. And I said to my publisher initially, look, even if we only have one book, or the first book rather, when people finish reading it, if they find close the last page and go, holy shit, there's more than I ever thought about being a cop. And it helps diminish the imposter syndrome when I read a lot of reviews.
Yep.
Because authors should always read reviews of their work, good or bad, good and bad rather. And the amount of people who've spoken about what they've learnt and the appreciation they now have for police is great. And also those who are either veteran police or military veterans, or relatives of both, that have reviewed it and said, it's helped them understand more and more about how their family members have been and why. Then that means just as much, if not more, to me.
Yeah, and I look at it as I think something you said earlier is that police are human. They have the same emotions, feelings, reactions, and those sorts of things that any other person listening to this podcast has throughout the day. They see a lot more and have a lot more happen that affect that, but the expectation is that they're not supposed to show it. And people possibly don't understand some of the things that happen that do affect the personalities of people who are police. The books and hopefully this podcast and this interview series with people who've done the job, people learn to understand that it's not just writing a traffic ticket. That's a basic thing what police do. Police do things that are really psychologically damaging, and the start of getting better around that is talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I spend a deal of my time now doing corporate presentations about mental fitness, resilience, recovery, understanding, and authenticity. And the first step to recovery and the first step to changing attitudes is to have authentic conversations.
Yep.
And I know we're probably getting a bit off topic, but if someone out there is and who is listening to this is struggling, the first thing that they need to understand is they're not alone in this. I thought I was the only one that felt that way for 30 years, and it was horrible. So you're not by yourself. You're not alone. If you have someone that you can open up to, then do it. If you are the person that's being opened up to, shut the hell up and don't try and solve anything.
Yep.
All people who are suffering want to have is someone who will listen to them without any judgment, without any solution provision, without any of that. They just want someone who can sit in the morass or sit in the mud with them and be there with them and then let them move on.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's the first step, but that's a whole different conversation, mate. That'll take me.
It is. I guess the only thing I would probably add to that is that you don't need to understand, you just need to listen.
Exactly right. Yeah.
All right. So before I move on, now you've got your own, obviously, website. Well, where can the people listening or watching or listening find your books? Where can they buy them? That sort of stuff. If you can give a plug for your website and that.
So my website is keithbanks.com.au. Very easy to remember. I keep a stock of books and I'm more than happy to personally inscribe them to whoever would like to buy them. So you jump onto that website. It's a bit clunky at the moment. It's actually being updated as we speak. But it's easy to find the books and you purchase that way. Whatever message you want on them, you let me know. And I have them all sent out. Secondly, Booktopia.
Yep.
Booktopia is subject to the whims of Australia Post, but they have they always have stock. Amazon. The book's available on Kindle, ebooks, Kindle,
Yep.
and Audible. And, a lot of bookstores still stock them. The product life cycle of books, though, is around probably 2 years, I suppose. But if they're not in a bookstore, I'd strongly suggest Booktopia.
And what are the names of the titles of the book?
Yeah, first one is Drugs, Guns and Lies. It's about my time as an undercover cop in Queensland's bad old days.
Yep.
And the second is Gun to the Head. So it's my story about the impact and aftermath of a tactical operations policeman, the forerunner to Queensland CERT. So, and Gun to the Head is both physical and metaphorical. So that's the one that was number 2 that I'm. You shouldn't have favourites, like you shouldn't have favourite kids. But I've got, that's my favourite book. Yeah.
Okay. So all those details will be in the description at the bottom underneath where you're listening or watching this particular podcast, and your website address will be in there as well. So if anyone wants to buy a book or just find out more about Keith, you can go to keithbanks.com.au. Okay, so what did you want to be when you were growing up?
Look, as I touched on before, mate, I had a pretty challenging childhood. So my stepfather was one of those generations of Australians, all too prevalent, that drank too much and beat his wife and harassed and, terrorised his family. So I wanted to, I can probably remember from the time I was 8 or 9, I wanted to do something that protected people from that, or protected people from predators, or protected people from bullies, essentially.
Yep.
So the police force was always running around in my mind. I also, as I got older, went to high school. I joined the Army Cadets, and in those days, the Army Cadet system taught you how to survive, shoot, navigate, all of the fun stuff. That's how I learned to shoot. And also the discipline was something that I just fell straight into. I loved it. I loved the whole sense of camaraderie. I loved the positive male role models who were teachers at school. So it doesn't take a shrink to figure out why. I was really attracted to the ADF, and in fact, that was probably my primary focus through my high school life. We moved around a lot from town to town, by the way. Yep. So where I ended up in a town near Townsville in Queensland, the local Army Cadet coordinator was a Vietnam veteran who was a warrant officer class 2. Amazing bloke, tough as nails, and almost took me under his wing, I suppose, because he knew what was happening in my home life. He was getting me ready to apply for Duntroon, which is now ADFA.
Yep.
And he was convinced I would have been accepted, and I probably would have. I was one of those nerdy kids who just realised that I was academically bright, and I put all self-deprecation aside. So that was my escape path, and I knew if I did well at school, I could go anywhere. I could get away from that whole environment. Around year 10, I think, we had a police recruiter who came to school and talked about the academy. The fact that you, in those days, could do years 11 and 12 as a paid cadet, another 12 months of police training, and then be sworn. And I looked at that and thought, and I guess it rekindled all of my childhood thoughts about policing. I always saw policing as a noble career. I was never interested in how much it was being paid. It was paid pretty ordinary in those days.
It was paid pretty ordinary when I joined too, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, it's not bad now, but it wasn't about the money for me. It was about doing something I thought was worthwhile. And situation at home got so bad that I couldn't stay for another year. So in order to apply for Duntroon, I would have had to have finished year 12.
Yeah.
So at the end of year 11, it was just I just had to get out, and so I applied for the police force cadet system. Went through in hindsight, I wouldn't say rigorous, but certainly a couple of interviews that were fairly pointed. So it wasn't I wasn't a shoo-in at all. But then I was accepted when I was on an Army Cadet under officer training camp. Came back home. My mum had signed the papers. My stepfather hated police, so he was against the whole idea. And again, I've written about that in my first book.
Yep.
And I've been able to do that because my mum sadly passed away some years ago, and so did he. So I think had she been alive, I wouldn't have been as forthright with those chapters. But that certainly had to be said because it shows motivation, I guess. So that was my thing. Was my escape, and came to the academy just before I turned 17, a couple of months before I turned 17.
Was
And,
the academy, was that a 12-month cadetship in those days?
No, I did year 12, and then I did
Yep.
another 12 months as a third-year cadet.
Okay.
So year 12 was a combination of academic and police studies, PTI, yelling, screaming. It was pretty brutal in those days. And it was designed that way, I think, across all academies to weed out those who were serious and those who weren't. And don't really have a problem with it.
It's quite funny because when I went through, I was a Muppet. Now, you'll know what that is. Mm-hmm. And we were sitting in a class one day, and one of the instructors, someone was playing up, one of the instructors said, 3 years ago, I'd make you run around the oval with a chair over your head, but I'm not allowed to do it anymore. And so we've all gone, there was 60 of us in the class, we've all gone, go on, do it. So he did. And one of the recruits is doing laps with the chair over his head. Anyway, the lecturer got called into the I think it's a superintendent that runs the academy. See the superintendent and got reprimanded because he was making someone run around. You don't do those sorts of things, and we're all sitting there going, "Oh my God, you're supposed to have self-discipline. You're supposed to be disciplined. Making someone run around the oval with a chair over their head is deemed to be wrong. You've got to learn there are consequences for your actions."
Yeah. Look, in my time, mate, we ran around the oval for whatever transgressions with a 303, an empty, unloaded, but an old 303 above our heads, and those things are heavy.
Yeah.
So we were made to duck walk on our haunches for 50 metres up, 50 metres back. Push-ups were doled out as punishment. Cleaning the toilets with a toothbrush, all of that sort of thing, which is very, very military. And obviously the world's evolved, but it taught you a lesson. And I hated it then, but in hindsight, didn't have a problem with it because I understood the rationale.
So, the one thing I hear when you talk about those sorts of things is, oh, that's very demeaning. How dare people demean you? I look at it in the sense that, okay, maybe cleaning the toilet with a toothbrush is demeaning, but realistically, most people clean the toilet with a big toothbrush anyway. Is it demeaning, or is it sort of getting you used to doing things that are going to upset you?
Yeah, I think the second. I think, and the difference with discipline, when I first joined, you were scared of anyone with the rank of sergeant. Senior sergeants were demigods. Inspectors were gods, and that whole paramilitary discipline thing, I think in a policing environment is essential because you need to be able to do what the hell you're told to do rather than stand and argue and question, which is something that you develop later. Certainly as an undercover cop, I had to think on my feet and do my own stuff, but in the initial couple of years of policing, you need to understand that you follow orders for a reason. You can certainly question bad orders, but I think a lot of that. Well, I'm very sure that a lot of that disciplined approach is now gone. You cannot be someone's leader and let them do their own thing. It's a bit of a vexed question.
It is. It's a can of worms that we're probably going in a bit of a rabbit hole. Look, I understand, and you lived through this. I came in afterwards. I was one of the bright, shiny, new recruits that were going to change the police for the better. You lived through the bad old days. The rationale behind it is that if you teach people to follow orders without questioning, then corruption is going to happen because people aren't going to question the orders of those that are above them. They're just going to do. Now, I think there's a difference between following orders and discipline.
Yeah, it depends. I lived in the corrupt environment, and I always say to people, the vast majority of men and women I met and worked with were honest, as I was. Yep. Following orders doesn't mean you have to blindly follow corrupt practices. You can certainly push back against that, and I did. My point is more, if you are told to do a particular job in a certain way that is, correct, you need to be able to follow that instruction. Is probably better than following orders. You need to be able to follow instructions on the road as a cop. A sergeant turns up and says, right, you will go here and do this. you go there and do that. What I do know now is that is a lot of younger coppers will argue.
Yeah.
And I think that undermines public confidence in a combined paramilitary force.
I think it also it undermines confidence, public confidence, because they see it, but it also undermines the identity of the organisation as well in that regard. So one of the things that we had to do was ethics. So we had to go to university and then to the academy, and we had to do ethics. And the ethics teachers were all about this fact that police are inherently corrupt, that following orders is inherently corrupt, that getting free McDonald's is inherently corrupt, without really understanding what policing is and what is required in regards to, like you said, if a sergeant turns up and says to you, I want you to go and do this, if you think it's illegal or corrupt, you go, okay, well, why? But you don't go, no, I'm not going to do it if it's not.
Yeah, I think, having lived through the Fitzgerald inquiry into corruption, I think the term corrupt was bandied about way too much. Corruption to me was to take money, steal drugs, steal money, so I'd say take money and bribes, engage in practices that weren't ethical, let's throw the word out there, for your own personal gain or the gain of others. Taking a 50% reduction in a McDonald's fast food chain is not corruption, because it's clever business on McDonald's behalf, because it meant they'd have cops there in areas that were potentially troublesome. You can have the whole conversation and go down the rabbit hole about noble cause corruption as well. Because I did the undergrad justice studies degree after the inquiry, and I railed against the generic all police are corrupt, all police are potentially corrupt narrative in a university setting. I was an experienced guy, and I was able to hold my own in an argument or a debate. But what I was more about, as a detective sergeant, or as a tactical operator, I ran teams. My tactical operators would have never dreamt of arguing the point with me if we were engaged on a high-risk raid, a high-risk job, a siege response, whatever, because that's what discipline's all about. And I guess that's more my point. In an emergency situation, you need to have a paramilitary organisation where people will obey orders from an operational perspective. The whole conversation around ethics and corruption is another one. And there were certainly a number of people, and I was one, who railed or pushed back against corrupt offers. So I think that's different from having a disciplined, structured paramilitary force.
I agree, but I think that the way that we're training police now, from my intake onwards, we've thrown both of them to mean the same thing, and which is why you're getting instances of people. I can remember when I was a senior connie and I had a brand new constable with me, and it was someone was being thrown out of the casino, and he was arguing. And, after 35 minutes of standing there trying to convince this guy to leave, I just said to the thing, we don't have time for this. Tell him to leave or arrest him. And he argued with me, well, that's not what we've been told we're supposed to do. We're supposed to help people. We're supposed to make them, yes, we are. But if someone's not going to, do you know what I mean? There needs to be a consequence. And I think the way that they're training people by taking that discipline out of the academy is causing the police service or the police force or whatever they're calling it these days more harm, because everything gets lumped together as the one issue.
Yeah, it's a vexed question, isn't it? You want to have police with the ability to operate independently and use discretion to make their own decisions, but you also need to have, as I keep saying, it's a paramilitary armed force.
Yep.
So there needs to be discipline in that, in which people understand that the rank structure's there for a reason, and they do what they're told. Because if someone's firing shots downrange at you, and unfortunately those major things don't happen anymore like they used to before Port Arthur. But I've been to situations, and I've written about them, where I've just turned up and given orders and taken control, and people have responded to the way in which they should have. Yep. When you have police officers who decide that, if they have 12 months service, and we all have been there, have 12 months service, and they know better than a non-commissioned officer, and they start to argue, then that's when discipline breaks down. It's not where policing should be.
No, agreed. All right, let's bring it back to the undercover side of stuff. So how long were you a police officer before you went into the covert work?
I volunteered for it, and I started it 2 months before I turned 22.
Okay, so 5 years,
No, I
nearly
was
in 4 years.
sworn in at 19, so
Okay.
almost 3.
3 years.
Yeah.
Why did you want to do covert work?
There were people dying in droves of heroin overdoses in the late 70s and early 80s.
Yep.
Right up to the late 80s, I think. But heroin was being brought in through pretty unprotected borders. So you talk about corruption, a combination of corrupt customs officials, unprotected borders, corrupt police, all through the country. And the heroin trade was out of control. It was really down to a guy called Terence John Clark.
Yep.
Clark with an E, who was a New Zealander, who ran a major international drug syndicate. So the quality of heroin that was coming in from the Golden Triangle was killing people every day. You know,
Yep.
I don't use the term junkies. I use the term addicts. I've seen high functioning addicts in every walk of life. But these young people, predominantly young people, and they were middle class. So heroin use wasn't a lower class drug. It was a middle class drug. We were finding bodies in toilet cubicles, sometimes on the street, etc., in houses, and just horrible.
Yep.
So I was fairly idealistic and naive, and I thought working undercover would be a good way to do something concrete about the drug trade. And essentially, at that age, you think you can change the world, and that's what I tried to do.
Fair enough.
I didn't realise how much it had changed me.
What was the most difficult thing of working undercover for you?
In spite of my upbringing, I was actually a nice guy. I was empathetic. I cared about people. I was polite. If I had to react on the street and take someone down in a violent blitz, absolutely I would. But the core of me, I was just a very nice guy. So one of the hardest things was changing that personality and adopting the personality of a mid-level dealer. And so I portrayed myself as a mid-level heroin dealer. And mid-level heroin dealers don't have the manners and the niceness that I'd had normally. So I had to learn and adapt and adopt the mannerisms of others. I had to speak in a certain way that wasn't the norm for me. I had to treat women like crap. I had to, assert a position even at the age of 22 that I was a shaker and a mover, I suppose, in the drug scene. Yep. So all of that stuff. One of the hardest things that I ever did was watch a 14-year-old kid be shot up with his first hit of heroin. I thought he was about 17 or 18. But I still couldn't have interfered anyway, and I found out later, about 4 years later, he died of a heroin overdose, and I carried that guilt for quite some time, and probably still do.
How do you address that guilt? It's never going to go away, okay? But how did you address that guilt?
Well, when I had my breakdown, I suppose a lot of things had compounded on me. That was one memory that came back. And I've just understood through research and self-awareness and therapy that you can't change what's happened in the past. You just need to, as best you can, accept it, understand it, and move through it. And that sounds simplistic, and it's a lot more detailed than that. But I just look back on it and think, well, what else could I have done? 4 years, when I think about that, I would think about I should have, could have, would have, but it's over and done. It's just been an impact on my life that's one of many trauma.
I guess, look, partially because I've been there, but the first question that comes to mind is, if you'd intervened then, coulda, woulda, shoulda, does that necessarily mean, one, a week later he wasn't going to take a hit somehow, some other way? Two, what would the outcome have been for you, even though the action was noble, so to speak?
Well, I was in the middle of a heroin operation, and
Yeah.
and I'd been in this particular region for about 3 months. The operation went for 6. So, and I was working by myself. There was no backup. So, I don't know what it was like in your time, but in my time, you worked one out, and that was it. There were no mobile phones, there were no pages. I didn't wear listening devices very often at all, and I was in a house where no one knew where I was. So, had I intervened, it would have been completely out of character. As I said, I thought he was about 17 or 18.
Yeah.
Would have been completely out of character for a heroin dealer who was buying high quality heroin in that area.
Yeah.
So it was on the Gold Coast. Would have been completely sus for me to go, hey, what do you think you're doing? Because my assumed identity, I was dealing, I was making a lot of money out of it. So could have resulted in some physical danger to me.
Yep.
It certainly would have blown the operation. And they're just decisions you make on the spur of the moment, because that's when you have to think independently. And, hence our last conversation about discipline. Undercover is an area where you need to think on your feet and take decisions. And there I was at the tender-old age of, I think, probably 23.
And, I guess the point I'm making is that we beat ourselves up, maybe not consciously, but unconsciously over these sorts of decisions, that there really isn't any other decision that could have been made at the time. And it's not your fault that happened. It's other people's fault that it happened. But working covertly, you take a lot of that on, and whether it's consciously or unconsciously, you think about it. And as you said, it's not until you go through an episode where you're forced to confront the reasons behind the behaviour that you have, or the feelings that you have, that you start to reflect on that and go, oh, that could be one of the things that's sitting at the back of why this has all come to where it's come. That's probably gone off a little bit tangent to the point that I was trying to make, more to the point that a lot of things that happen out of the control of police in general and covert police especially, that we allow to weigh on us without thinking that it's weighing on us. And one of the things that I talk about is the fact that I became friends with some of the people I was dealing with, buying drugs from, buying property from, whatever it was. They were actually nice people. And there's a part of you where you have to go, okay, here I am with a person that I think is okay. They think I'm okay. They believe that I'm not a good person, obviously a bad person because I'm buying drugs, but is an okay person who has, a daily interaction with them or what have you. But at the heart of it, I know that what I'm doing is going to change their life profoundly.
Yeah, sense of identity is interesting. So, again, I've written very openly and I've spoken very openly about the fact that there were a lot of people I met when I was undercover whose company I preferred to that of a lot of police. So, and that's the challenge. It's one of the challenges of working as a UC is that you need to remember who you are at the core of yourself.
Yep.
You're operating under an assumed name. You're acting in a way that's not normal, etc. But I found there were some drug dealers that I could actually relax with, not to the extent, obviously, relaxing completely, but I had a lot of fun with. I look forward to having a beer with them, I'd have a chat with them, we'd have a laugh, we'd make our drug deals, then we'd socialise. Often I preferred buying heroin because it was a business deal. But when you're enmeshed in an ongoing operation and you become part of their world, then it's impossible not to socialise with them. So, I'd have a mantra in the morning when I'd get up, and I'd literally look in the mirror and say, your name is Jim, I think was my name then. You're a heroin dealer, but you're also a cop, right? And I just had this little, like a psychological mantra to just, say, never forget who you are. And
a bit like that scene out of Reservoir Dogs before he goes up on the...
rehearsing the story,
Well, no, not that part, but where just before he goes off to do the smash and grab, the diamond heist, he puts his ring on and he says, "I am this. I am a police officer. I'm working undercover. You've got this. They don't know who I am."
Yeah, similar, yeah, very similar. And I'd be surprised if a lot of UCs don't do the same thing.
I did.
Because you need to remember why you're there and why you're doing it. But having said that, mate, look, let's be brutally honest. Working in that world is a rush, and it's adrenaline,
Yeah,
fear, and exhilaration. At the same time, and it's like a friend of mine describes it very well. Think about the most dangerous thing you've ever done in your life, whether it be jumping out of a plane or off a cliff or hot air ballooning or whatever. Get that in your mind and then do it 3 times a week for 2 years. That's what undercover's like. And that stuff becomes quite addictive.
Yes.
The adrenaline, the fear. I think I've used a phrase that, fear and exhilaration are blood brothers, but be careful what you wish for. Because that life, as appealing as it was, and back in those days, hair regulations were strictly enforced. Your uniform had to be pristine. All of you'd be screamed at or punished if it wasn't.
Yep.
And having worked in a uniform environment where everything is strictly controlled, and then moving into the undercover world where we had no control, no controllers, no specific contacts, no backup, no support, and living alone often, wearing what you wanted, dressing, looking how you wanted, hair, beards, earrings. Police weren't allowed to have beards in those days.
Mm-hmm.
Earrings were certainly never allowed. So to be able to change your appearance and dress the way you want and look the way you want was kind of cool. And not being told when to take a meal break, and not being told when to be at the office, not being told when to leave the office, all of that, for a young bloke was really appealing. The problem was, with that freedom came no support. So, again, in my first book, I've written about being forced to take a line of speed at gunpoint, probably 2 lines of speed at gunpoint. Never used drugs in my life. And there was zero support from the drug squad. When I reported it, when I snuck into the office and said, okay, here's the speed I bought from this guy, put a gun in my face, I went, oh, well, big deal. And they, we'll put on the running sheet, he's got a gun just for when they do the raids. I was never asked how I was. I was never asked if I needed any help. And the culture was different then as well. It was an alpha male, alpha female culture, and as you touched on before. And if you showed any weakness, you'd probably be thrown to the wolves.
Yeah.
So if you showed weakness, you wouldn't be regarded well. If you showed certainly any sign of mental weakness or mental health concerns, and I say mental weakness because that's what we've been regarded as.
Yep.
If you showed any mental health concerns, you'd be sidelined.
Yep.
Because you wouldn't probably trusted. So all of that stuff has a compounding effect. So undercover for me was a rush. It was an environment where we did smoke a lot of cannabis. We weren't formally encouraged to, but were informally encouraged to. Just do what you got to do. There were friends of mine who used. One of them started using heroin because he was in a situation he had to.
Yep.
He became very quickly addicted. Some of us have those personalities. I never used it. I never wanted to use it. I never would have used it, but he had no choice.
Is there a reason, talking about the personality, so I was very aware that I have an addictive personality, which was why I always came up with an excuse as to why I couldn't use, I simulated, as we called it, smoking dope. But I was aware that I had a family history of addictive personality, and my concern was, and I've since worked out that I do have an addictive personality. My concern was that by starting, even taking something small just to show I could do it, was going to lead down to becoming an addict. So I didn't. Do you think that the job itself, the UC work itself, leans towards people who have that addictive personality?
Oh, I don't. Just trying to think of all the people I knew. Again, that's a whole psychological discussion,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Well, you wouldn't have had the casino in your days, would you?
Yeah, I think the casino on the Gold Coast was in
Oh,
operation in
possibly.
the
Okay.
80s. Yeah. But I just didn't want to put that shit in my body. So from day one when I was buying heroin, I'd just say I'm this for the money. I'm not
Yep.
in it for the rest of it. And that got actually got a lot of admiration from a street level. And certainly then when I started buying from more advanced dealers, they regarded me as one of theirs because they were the same. But I think the addictive personality part for me was alcohol. I didn't drink before I started working undercover, and it got good to me pretty quickly.
Yep.
So that was what I had to watch, and I still do all these years later. So yeah, it's an interesting question, but when you've got young men with no supervision and they think they have to take drugs to prove that they're part of it, that caused a lot of problems. Resulted in a lot of broken careers.
Did you have to do a call? And just I think prior to your book coming out, there's been 2 or 3 others. Dan, why can't I remember his name?
Yeah.
Dan Crowley has wrote a book about his time, more to do with the undercover and the playing football. But there was another couple of books that came out from people who were probably around your era of working undercover, who became addicts, talking about people that went on to become, I think there's one went on to become a bank robber, or rob banks, maybe not a bank robber, but went down that path and got caught. When you went through and said, okay, hey, I want to be a UC, was there a course? Was there anything at all? Or was it like, all right, go find yourself somewhere to live, here's $1,000?
There was nothing. Yeah, we were simply accepted, took some leave to grow hair or whatever, and came back and started. So the first job I did, I tagged along with another UC for 3 or 4 weeks to try and learn as best I could, and then basically thrown into the deep end. As I progressed through and I was only there for 2 years, I became pretty vocal about that. So every new UC that would come in would work with me or work with another established undercover for more than a couple of weeks.
Yep.
So, we basically had our own informal training course, but no, there was nothing. Pretty much learn on the job, learn from your mates. So it progressed later. After I left, I went back to the drug squad as a detective about a year or 2 later. And we started looking at a training course. I think the first covert police officer course might have been 88, 89, somewhere around there, because I instructed on a couple of them. But in my day, there was nothing.
When 95, 96, yeah, that sounds about right. 95, 96, 97. I was when I did it, and there was a 3-week course. There was a proper covert unit. There was a senior sergeant. There was a couple of sergeants who had our welfare at heart. Yeah, they did. The sergeants were really, really good. There was no, the things we've been talking about. There was an understanding, but no real organisational drive behind that. It was just them. If you've got a problem, give me a call. If you want to talk, give me a call. I at least had a controller who I spoke to virtually every day on some jobs. On other jobs, it might be 2 or 3 times a week. So it had changed. And as I left, they were talking about bringing in drug testing, and they were talking about bringing in a psychologist to talk to prior to leaving, and they were capping the amount of time that you could do to 2 years. So you could do 2 years, that was it, no more, and then you're out. So they were taking steps in the right direction. I still think a lot of it was more, this is what we're going to do, as opposed to what they actually did.
Yeah, and we have to be careful, I suppose, about how much we talk about this, I guess. But
Yeah.
from my perspective, when I was a detective sergeant in crime operations area, I was in the major crime area, I was running two coverts in the property world.
Yep.
I absolutely made sure that their welfare was first and foremost in my mind. They had all the support they wanted. Things had changed certainly from an equipment and a resourcing and a methodology perspective, but I wanted to make sure they were okay.
Yep.
So that was my focus, and I did that because there was no support for my cohort.
Yep.
And I think it comes down to, it's like anything in policing, mate, it comes down to the individual officer, whether an NCO or a senior connie or whoever's in charge.
Yeah.
Because I was a controller for a little while as well, controller for a while as a part-time thing. But it just comes down to the individual and their focus on mental health and welfare. And I know these operators that were working for me were incredibly grateful and still are.
I guess maybe I wasn't clear. The people that were involved individually, as in my controllers and the sergeants that I reported to, they had our best interests at heart. And just as you said, I think organisationally, the organisation itself was, oh yeah, we're going to do this, but it was not really. Do you know what I mean? It was like,
yeah, I do. Yeah.
So that wasn't it's not a reflection on the people, because the people, and I still catch up with the sergeants who ran the squad now some 20 years later, and they still have your welfare at heart.
There's a lot of UCs that have worked in a variety of areas. Some of the states I've read about who've infiltrated outlaw motorcycle gangs and have been riding with them for 3 and 4 and 5 years have found it impossible to come back to the real world.
And it's interesting that duality that you talk about. Now, we may not have gone as deep as what you're talking about, although I was probably the level below where you were dealing. I got married during my time working undercover. So, I finished a job, got married, went away for 2 weeks for a honeymoon, came back, started another job. The duality around that was that the next job I had to pretend I was, well, not the next job, one of the jobs down the track, I had to pretend that I was gay, and I spent every single night at a strip club with strippers. Yet I was newly married. And it's this whole, and I couldn't tell my then wife, oh yeah, what are you doing tonight? Oh, I'm just going down to the strip club. Do you know what I mean? That was going to cause issues. And I guess the way I rationaled it at the time was, this is a game. I'm playing the game. My role in this game is I'm getting evidence to put the bad people away. The other people in the game are the bad people.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say, mate. Is that, organisations can have the best intentions, but it comes down to the individual person who's actually looking after others that I think counts. But the whole the undercover world is one where identity is key, and the biggest challenge is retaining your sense of identity and who you are, and yet portraying another character. So that's where, and I was going to say family support, but that's where support of your peers and your network and people who know what you're doing is important. But in my day, we just went deep. I certainly did. I lied to my friends who were not cops. I lied to some cops and just said I'd been fired. I'd been, removed from the police. All my civilian friends thought I was disgraced. And I did that, living a dual identity. So when I finished my undercover, I thought I was pretty much unscathed. It's only years later that I've realised that, that there were some pretty traumatic things in there that affected my personality and had an impact on me later. And working undercover is all about a duality of existence, isn't it?
Now, I have had discussions with people who have done undercover, and they've gone, that's, it's not a game. It's more than a game. It's real life, which it is. But I had to view it in that sense to give my brain the ability to sort of go, don't go too far down one side.
Yeah, I guess we all cope with it a little differently. See, the difference in my era was that we lived 24 hours in an operation. So even operations in Brisbane, I was armed all the time, every time I left my unit, because I would run into people, because Brisbane's a small town.
Yep.
So majority of jobs I did were outside the metropolitan area, which means all the dealers knew where you lived. You had to be on 24 hours a day. You had to ensure that your demeanour and your behaviour was on all the time. So, I didn't have relationships. I couldn't have been able to manage a relationship and work undercover, because we were always
Yep.
away and always on. So, different eras, I guess. And, I am aware that I've got a friend in the USA who's I've got a friend in Canada as well, who I mentioned when we chatted before
Yep.
the podcast. These guys are working full-time UC.
Yep.
And yet there are others who do occasional jobs, and then go back to a normal life for a while, then do an occasional job.
Yeah, that blows my mind.
Yeah, but I guess the conversation today is about how the undercover world operated as best as we're allowed to say, as you know, and also I guess the personal impact. So, I've had friends who've gone to jail because they crossed the line. I've had friends who have never really been able to come back to the real world and be who they were before. I've had other friends who were easily able to adapt back to policing and had a long and fruitful career. So I think it just comes down to the individual, but also it's vital for an organisation to have that follow-up and support and reintegration.
Yeah, and having been out of the organisation now, I left in 2004, 2003. So I've been out nearly 20 years now. I can't tell you whether that's happened or whether that's changed. Just want to change tack. What are some of the biggest myths you think the public have about undercover work?
I think the biggest myth, number one, is they think it's glamorous.
Yep.
Number two is that undercovers always have surveillance around them, and I don't know what happens now, but people used to think that we were followed by surveillance teams everywhere and we had little transmitting devices on our bodies, and again, that was another myth. And that the undercover world is surrounded by beautiful women and parties, etc. And a lot of it is not. A lot of it's very lonely. A lot of it's very mentally demanding.
Yep.
It's draining. It's exhausting. You never sleep properly. You certainly, your hypervigilance is a sign of PTSD, but you live your life in a hypervigilant state. And I would think the other is that if you were raised in the 80s, it was Miami Vice, where you had Sonny Crockett and Tubbs who were driving Maseratis and Lamborghinis and dressing, the way they were. It's a dirty job where you live to meet people with the firm intention of betraying them, and that's something that the general public wouldn't see or understand. It's tough as a human being to befriend someone, as we talked about, with the intention of betraying them. Yeah, without doubt.
And that has it has lasting impacts, and I've spoken about this in my podcast. I've divorced twice. It's tough to have a relationship, and I think part of that is because there's always that, once you have, for me, the relationship is, okay, well, what's the do you know what I mean? There's always that thought of what's the purpose in this relationship. You just go into that, this is what I've done previously. There's a whole Pandora's box there I'm not going to open, which has been opened in other places.
Trusting people is tough, yeah.
Well, it's not so much trusting; it's trusting myself with that person.
Well, I guess I'm the other way as well, mate, because being such an accomplished liar, you probably subconsciously wonder whether you can trust anybody.
Well, I guess that's probably true. What's something surprising you learned about yourself doing undercover work?
Probably how I adapted fairly well and fairly quickly to new situations. I was a bit of a shy kid. I was, as I said, a nice young cop, and it surprised me how quickly I could establish relationships, I think, and overcome that shyness and just blend in and be a chameleon. I didn't think I'd be that good at it, but I was.
When you were first a police officer, did people say, "Oh, you just look like a copper"?
No, never. No,
Never?
not even now. I'll even at my age and social circumstances, people find out my background and go, "Wow, I never would have thought you'd be one of them." And I deliberately manufactured that as well. I did not want to be like a lot of my peers, who were probably brash, overbearing, typical coppers. No, and I think. I think also, and this sounds a bit arrogant, but I wanted to be the one that people would go, "Oh, actually, I met this cop the other day. He's a pretty cool bloke, and he's a nice guy, and they're not all bastards."
Yeah, I don't think you were alone in that. That was something that I have. Now, I think there are probably more people than not that thought I was a real bastard, but hey, the intent was there. I just wanted to touch on you said when you left, you went straight back to the drug squad. In my
no, eventually back to the drug squad. I went back to the uniform for 6 months.
Okay. Now, we did the same. I went back and stayed in uniform. The rationale being that you need to learn to be a police officer again and get that undercover stuff out of your system. What sort of backlash isn't the word I want, but it's the word I'll use. Did you get from the crusty old senior sergeants who had been in the job 30 years, 40 years, and here you were, someone who'd been running around playing pretend, coming back to uniform to be a real police officer?
Mate, quite the opposite, actually. I had a lot of support. I had a lot of support from older coppers because I think they understood, that being an undercover, I don't know how they did, but being an undercover was a tough gig. So I didn't have a lot of backlash at all. The consequence I found was that I just didn't like it anymore. It just didn't excite me enough. So
fair enough.
I was looking for the next rush, and I do know. I have. I've said to people over the years, when you finish UC, don't expect a ticker tape parade.
Yep.
But what I mean by that is people aren't going to go, "Oh my God, you're so wonderful." But I had some. Yeah, no, I had a lot of support. I remember I went back the first day back into mobile patrols, which doesn't exist anymore, and I'd had my hair cut, but it still wasn't regulation. And the superintendent was addressing the new arrivees, and he thought I was a trainee and made a pointed comment about hair regulations. And then he came and got me an hour or two later after he realised where I'd come from. He said, "Oh, don't worry about that, mate. Jesus, I heard you finished at the druggies. Thank you." And he said, "The hair conversation is just for trainees. Don't worry about it." So that was, well, mind you, he was one out of the box. So yeah, the support was pretty good.
I had my nose pierced during the entire period I was working undercover, and chucked my uniform on. Then I gone, "Oh shit, I haven't taken my nose ring out yet."
I didn't go that far.
Yeah, that was a bet that was made that no one else turned up to, and I went, "Oh, stuff it, I'll still have to go through with it and get my nose pierced." And it's interesting because I've heard stories where people go, "Hey, that's really good." The people I work with wanted to know about. I was working with I've been in a week and I was working with a trainee. It was like, yeah, okay, you look after the trainee. And she loved hearing the stories and that sort of stuff. I did have a senior sergeant that said to me, "You're a washed up UC. You don't understand policing. You've got no idea now about what real policing is. You're just a druggie." And it was like, "Well, you don't know me," that sort of thing. Yeah. And there is, I reckon, there's probably a 60-40 split of people who have that experience when they come out.
Yeah, you get some clowns everywhere, and unfortunately, I think the clowns comment. I would have responded to him in a certain way, which may not have been in keeping.
He was an inspector, so I still had a little bit of that.
Yeah, but I came out with a lack of respect for authority. I came out with independent thinking. And I certainly would challenge stupidity where I saw it, which didn't do me all that well in my later career. But I think when you have negative comments like that, you probably remember them more than the positive ones.
Yeah.
And that's just the nature of life, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it's been 30 years since that's happened, and I remember that comment.
Yeah, you wouldn't expect that, that level of or that type of comment to be made to someone. That may well have been jealousy, may well have been he wanted to do it years ago and wasn't able to. Who'd know what motivation is for that?
It was probably about your vintage, that's for sure.
Yeah, it may well have been the case.
Do you have a war story? People love war stories, and some people like telling them, some people don't. Do you have a story that you can sort of talk us through, something, a buy that you did that stands out to you that you remember to this day, that you either go, how did I get through that, or why did that happen?
Oh, many of them. Look, there was a job I did in North Queensland, this time with a colleague, and I went up there as the controller because he'd been undercover for 5 years. He was burnt out, poor bugger. And I was supposed to be the controller. I ended up moving in the same unit and just worked with him as a side-by-side UC. We had a list of targets that we'd worked on, we bought from, so it was, again, a deep operation. But we came across this guy who told us that he told us a certain name, which turned out not to be his name. It's okay, I told him our names and turned out not to be ours. And we got on quite well. And he was an ex-Gypsy Joker biker.
Yep.
Didn't know much else about his background, and we were buying a lot of drugs from him. We were setting up a major buy, probably about 200 grand. In those days, in the 80s, was a lot of money.
Yep.
And it was going to take place in Kuranda, north of Cairns, in the rainforest. So all organised, and did the job. And a couple of things happened, and I've written about it in the book as well. I was recognised by someone I'd gone to school with when I was with him, and I tap danced my way out of that. But I remember he looked at me with his evil eyes, and I thought, oof, Jesus. Anyway, end of the job happens. The buy didn't go ahead for a couple of reasons. But when he was arrested, he told the investigating detectives that, well, you got me. I'm an escapee from Yatala prison in Adelaide. He'd murdered two guys in the Northern Territory, cut them up with a knife for a while, then turned them face down and shot them in the back of the head. I think he thought they had a lot of gold with them, and they didn't, because they were prospectors.
Yeah.
Anyway, he'd been sentenced. He gleefully escaped from Yatala, and he'd been on the run for quite some time. And he told them that he'd intended to kill me for the buy money. And the detective told me that, and I went, well, that's disappointing, because I thought we were mates. And we actually got on very well. We used to get out and drink and have an entertaining time together. And the irony is, all the time I was planning to betray him and have him sent to jail, he was planning to betray me and kill me. And we both gave each other false names.
Yeah.
That's one of the most ironic ones I've got.
Yeah, no, I think it's a little bit more than ironic, but it's interesting too that Cairns seems to be the place that most, pardon the paraphrasing here, dead shits end up at the end of the line.
Yeah, north of Cairns, made up in Cape Trib, it's still a good place to hide.
Yep, most definitely. Last couple of questions for you. What do you think is the most crucial trait someone needs to be, firstly, a police officer, and secondly, if they're a police officer and want to go undercover?
I think a sense of justice in both.
Yep.
I think you really have to have a sense of justice and fairness, and to be a cop, it's not about running red lights and driving at high speed. Not you're allowed to do that anymore anyway. But
it was fun though.
It was. It's just about to have a sense of fairness about what you do.
Yep.
Being an undercover cop, I would think that you just need to be aware of how it will change you as a person. I didn't realise it would. Probably for the better in some circumstances, but probably for the worse in others. But it's not as glamorous as it seems, and be prepared for it to be dirty, sometimes unjust, and bloody hard work.
Very true. Last question. What advice... no, I just asked you what advice, didn't I? No, I asked what advice do you have for someone who wants to be a police officer, firstly, and then secondly, who wants to be a UC? But I think you just answered that with the UC as the understanding.
Yeah.
But what advice would you have for someone who wants to be a police officer, full stop?
I still think it's the best job in the world. I still think it's the most noble profession you can do. It broke me, but I pushed myself forward for every dangerous job I could get. That's for a number of reasons. And again, tease a read about them, and it's all there. Yep. But I think being a cop, and you need to also be aware that your network around you will view you differently. You will always be Bill the cop or Mary the cop. You won't be Bill or Mary anymore.
Yep.
You will see the worst that people can do to each other, and that's an experience that will change you, but it also gives you the reality of life. And I think it's important to understand the reality of life, because it can make you a more rounded and better person. It can also make you be well aware of your family dynamics and your friends' dynamics, because you become very protective. I would much rather have seen what I've seen and gone through what I've gone through than have lived my life in blissful ignorance. I think that would be the boring life to lead.
I agree. Just in regards to that we talk about, you're glad that you've done it, as made you the person you are now, and all those sorts of things. We've acknowledged the psychological issues and the psychological impacts that both myself and yourself it has had. What would you say to someone who wants to join the police in regards to how do you protect yourself as much as you can to not fall victim to those impacts?
That's a hard one, mate. Building of resilience, building of personal resilience, that's what I present to organisations about now.
Yep.
In order to be resilient, you have to almost be broken. And building resilience is about falling down 7 times, standing up 8. I think the ability to have a good, strong network around you, the ability to be authentic with your friends, family, partners, whatever, about how things are affecting you is vital. And there's a lot of things. The holy trinity: sleep, diet, exercise. If in order to build resilience, if you sleep well, if you eat as best you can, occasional KFC doesn't hurt, but also start getting into exercise right now and continue it all through your police career. Don't fall into the don't be a dick, let's go to the pub mentality that used to exist. So, sleep, diet, exercise, incredible components of mental health. And the other is to understand and learn that you can't change anything that's outside your circle of influence.
Yep.
Whatever you can do within that circle to change and be a good person and positively affect others, absolutely do it every day. But what you can't change, learn to let it go. And if you do that, then your mental health and fitness are going to be much better positioned than others.
I'd probably add on to that don't be ashamed to talk to someone when you need to, and don't feel that it's wrong to talk about your feelings and with someone who will listen to you.
Yeah, for sure. Yep, absolutely.
All right. Look, it's probably a good place to end the interview with you. Keith, thank you very much for your time. It's been
we've had a long chat there, mate.
We have. It's been almost an hour and a half. It's been very enlightening for me, and I'm sure for the listeners of the podcast that it will be very enlightening as well. What I'll do is, before winding up, I'll leave the last comment to you.
Look, I think these podcasts and all information that we can get to members of the public have a twofold effect. One is that they will realise policing is not what they thought it was, that it has a human toll. But I think also, people that you're going to be speaking with and these types of podcasts, I think the listeners hopefully will have a greater sense of comfort that policing is generally populated by good people and not corrupted by the few who aren't.
I totally agree with that. Now, your website again, keithbanks.com.au.
keithbanks.com.au.
Yes. Your books are for sale there, or you can find them online. I suggest that you check them out. And Keith, thank you for your time today. And to everyone else, thank you for listening to the Whisper in the Shadows, the interview series podcast. If you're a current or past undercover cop and you'd like to tell your story or talk about what you do, just as Keith has done, then please email me at whisperintheshadowspodcast@gmail.com. Thank you very much, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks, mate.